Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to the webinar on European Research Council Starting and Consolidator Grants, brought to you by EURAXESS Australia and New Zealand in collaboration with European Research Council. First of all, please allow me to introduce to you two esteemed guest speakers for today. Dr. Gemma Solomon, who is a professor at the University of Copenhagen. She is a recipient of the Starting Grant in 2010 and the Consolidator Grant in 2019. She will give you some tips and advice from a consolidator grantee perspective. Likewise, we also have with us Dr. Damien Evans, who is a research fellow at the French Institute of Asian Studies. He is a recipient of Starting Grant in 2014 and the Consolidator Grant in 2020. He will also give you some tips and advice from a starting grantee perspective. And I'm Nishant Sandilia, Regional Coordinator for EURAXESS Australia and New Zealand. For those who have joined our webinar for the first time, very briefly, EURAXESS is an initiative of the European Commission that addresses barriers to the mobility of researchers and seeks to enhance scientific collaboration between Europe and the rest of the world. We provide free information about European research, career opportunities, international collaboration, and networking possibilities. Since all of you are watching this on your laptop or phone, I'll encourage you to type EURAXESS Australia and New Zealand on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, or YouTube, and follow or subscribe us there. Also, I'd like to encourage you to please use the chat function in the interface to ask any question that you might have while our speakers are presenting. Once the presentations are done, we will come back to take your questions. Please note that the recording and the slides of the session will be provided to you. The recording will not include Q&A, and hence I'll recommend you to stay for the entire duration if you want our experts to address the common queries that the applicants have. Okay, perfect. So let's begin the session. And what I'll do is I'll quickly share my screen so that all of you can have a look at it as well. Please let me know if you can see it. Is it visible now? Perfect. So very quickly, we are looking at the European Research Council Starting and Consolidator Grant. To begin this, what we need to understand is it's a part of Horizon Europe. So what is this term Horizon Europe? You might have been hearing about Horizon 2020, which is the EU's Research and Innovation Framework Program that ended in 2020. These are framework programs, large umbrella sort of framework programs that runs for 7 years. So the Horizon 2020 program ended in 2020. The new Horizon Europe program starting this year will go till 2027 with an overall budget of around 95.5 billion euros. And ERC has an approximate budget of around 16 billion euros, which constitutes around 17% of the entire Horizon Europe budget. So in that frame, you can see that Horizon Europe and ERC have a significant part. If you look at how ERC funding has evolved, starting from 2007, when ERC started its operation, the funding from ERC has increased gradually. And if you look at the 2020 version, it is the highest. So 2014 to 2020, there was an overall budget of 13 billion euros, and this time it's 16 billion. So of course, there is a higher commitment to ERC's related funding. The ERC has a scientific council. There are these 22 eminent scientists who look after everything that happens in ERC, and which is chaired by Professor Jean-Pierre Bougonneau. And there are 3 vice presidents as well, and there are several very eminent scientists, of course, in your field as well. But it's just to let you know that there are very excellent experts who head this scientific council in and cover a lot of the fields that we will be looking at. Of course, you are aware that ERC grants, be it Starting, Consolidator, or Advanced Grant, are open for researchers with any discipline. So of course, you have to keep that in mind. Then just a look around about the ERC in figures. So there are over 12,000 projects that have been funded since ERC came into its establishment, and there have been 85 nationalities that have been granted. And of course, this includes 35 UN associated countries who have been hosting these ERC projects. And just a few numbers in terms of publication, you have more than 150,000 publications reported by ERC projects and more than 1,300 prestigious prizes awarded to ERC grantees, including the Nobel Prize. And last but not the least, the fact about more than 80,000 researchers who have had worked in an ERC team. So of course, these are big numbers that we would like to have look about. But this slide is particularly interesting because this shows that there are 48 non-EU nationalities that have received ERC funding. And if you look at the concrete number, it's 8% of all ERC grant. The PIs are non-EU or associated nationality. And this is particularly interesting if you look at Australia and New Zealand. This is a question that I generally get asked a lot during these webinars and sessions, how many grantees have received grants in Australia and New Zealand. So these are the numbers. For Starting and Consolidator Grant, of course, we do have the breakdown, but if you look at it in an overall perspective, there are 49 researchers from Australia and 17 from New Zealand who have received ERC Starting and Consolidator Grants. And if you also look at the trend for Starting and Consolidator Grant, since 2007, there has been a good increase in the proportion of evaluated proposals from non-EU nationals. The only reason that we put these slides is for you to be aware that there are perceptions about barriers, and then there are barriers, right? So of course, it's better for you to understand what you can apply to, what you cannot apply. So ERC is one of that European funding that all the nationalities can apply. So let's look into a little bit detail about the two particular grants that we are talking about, the Starting Grant and the Consolidator Grant. Beginning with the Starting Grant, as you are aware, the size of the grant is 1.5 million, and there is an addition of 1 million. Of course, I'll explain a little bit about the 1 million later. The duration for this grant is 5 years, and the eligibility is 2 to 7 years of experience since completion of PhD. There is a caveat here as well, which we will look slightly now. And then we have the Consolidator Grant. It has a size of up to 2 million euros and an addition of 1 million euro again. Duration 5 years. And as you are aware already in the requirement for this webinar, it's for 7 till 12 years of experience since completion of PhD. So what is this 2 to 7, 7 till 12 years of eligibility period? Of course, it's very simple when you define it like that, but there are certain criteria that allow these eligibility period to be extended. There are 4 specific things. So for instance, if there is a request for maternity extension, there is an extension of 18 months that you can include in this after the call deadline. If it is after the call deadline, it is not applicable. If it is before the call deadline, then the maternity of 18-month extension can be accepted. Then there is the paternity extension as well, which allows the time of paternity leave taken before the child is born or after the PhD has been awarded. Then there is this long-term illness or national service, which is an extension by the document that amounts to the leave taken by a PI until the call deadline. And then there is the last one, which is the clinical training. This is an extension by documented amount of clinical training received by PIs after the award of the first eligible degree and until the call deadline. And this has a maximum duration of 4 years. So these are the criteria that can be included if there is a request for extension of eligibility. Now we look at the 1 million caveat that we had. So there is this up to 1 million of additional funding that is available. Of course, this is for PIs who are going to move to EU or any associated countries, as long as this movement is exclusively linked to ERC project. Of course, there are still costs that are eligible and listed in the budget table. We'll slightly look at this after this slide. And this could include, for example, costs to ship or purchase equipments or consumables needed for the lab. Then we have the requests that need solid argument for additional funding. And of course, you need to understand that the final decision is with the review panel, whether these costs are being justified for the proposed research. If you look at the reason for additional budget, the most specific one is the startup cost for PIs to move to EU or an associate country, but also to purchase any major equipment or to access certain large facilities, and anything that has a major experimental or fieldwork cost, which does not include any personnel cost. This is why you might receive an additional 1 million of the budget. So let's look at the 2021 calendar. Starting Grant opened on 25th of February and has a deadline of 8th April. The Consolidator Grant recently opened on 11th of March and has a deadline of 20th April. So looking at these, and also let's look at the number for 2021. So Starting Grant, if you look at the budget, there is a budget of 619 million euros, which would be estimated for a number of 413 grants to be granted. So it's fairly large. And similarly for Consolidator, it's 633 million euros, and it's estimated that 317 grants will be granted for 2021. One particular thing which I include in the box is ERC is particularly interested and is encouraging excellent PIs from non-associated third countries like Australia and New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand is still considered third countries and are not associated to Horizon Europe yet. So this is something that ERC has explicitly stated. They want people from non-associated third countries to apply for this. And that is why it is of higher interest for you to participate in. One interesting thing we always get asked is the minimum time commitment. If you look at Starting Grant, you need to at least invest 50% of your time on the ERC project, and 50% is in an EU member state or an associated country. So you have to spend 50% of your time here. In terms of Consolidator Grant, on the ERC project, you can spend 40%, but you have to be in an EU member state or associated country 50% of your time. This is something that is a minimum time commitment requirement. Now let's look at something which is fairly straightforward. So ERC, when you are submitting your application, there are 3 domains that you can choose from: life sciences, social sciences and humanities, and physical sciences and engineering. Of course, within these domains, as you can see, under life science, there are 9 panels. Under social sciences and humanities, there are 7 panels. And under physical sciences and engineering, there are 11 panels. So you can choose which panel you want your application to be included for. Of course, the ERC team will also have a look at it if your proposal is actually being categorized under the panel that it should be, but it makes a lot of sense for you to choose this panel. Now let's very briefly look at how are the ERC proposal evaluated. So if you are aware of the ERC structure, there are Part A and Part B. So Part A is purely administrative, and then you have this Part B1 and Part B2. The first step is remote assessment by panel members of your application. So in this step, only section 1, which is the Part B1, synopsis and CV is being judged. So when these all judgments are being done, there is a panel meeting wherein all these panelists come together. Then you receive a score based on your Part B1. If your score is B, or if your score is C, then your proposal is rejected and the feedback to applicants are being given. Mind you, if your score is B, you have to wait for 1 year to apply. If your score is C, you have to wait 2 years to apply. Then, if you have got a score A, your proposal is retained and it goes to step 2. What is step 2? This is where your Part B1 and B2 is assessed by panel members and remote reviewers for the full proposal. Of course, in the remote reviewers, you can choose 3 people who you want to exclude from the panel to judge your proposal. So this is something that you need to be aware. Then, of course, again, the judgment happens, panel meetings, and then the interview for the Starting Grant, Consolidator Grant, and also from this year for the Advanced Grant, there is this interview that will happen. And lastly, then the scores are provided. If you get an A, of course, you are eligible for funding. Then if you score B, again, you can apply next year. Mind you, when you receive a score A, it depends upon what your ranking is. So if you are ranked very high in terms of the number of proposals that can be funded, you will automatically receive funding. However, there are possibilities when there is an extremely large amount of very good proposals. Despite receiving score A, you might not be getting the funding. And this happens sometimes, but is a very rare case when there are a very high volume of proposals that are extraordinary. So few last slides to burst some myths about what ERC funding entails. So ERC funds frontier research, including applied research. This is something that needs to be clear to all of you. The budget is distributed among the scientific panel as a function of demand. There is a tendency for people to tell that some of the panels have a high volume of applications, so you will not be successful because they need to distribute, right? But that is not the case. The panel that receives higher number of applications definitely gets higher number of allocation for grants. So the budget is distributed among scientific panels as a function of demand. Then the panel descriptors do not represent ERC scientific priorities. This is also something that we put as a disclaimer. The panel descriptors are there, but it is not something that signifies scientific priorities. The success rate is virtually flat across the eligibility window, whether it's starting grant or consolidator grant. Of course, starting grant generally is around 13%, consolidator grant is around 12%, but it's more or less similar. Another important factor is the publication record is not decisive in the selection decision. Yet another very interesting thing that we always get asked about is the host institution. The host institution is not an evaluation criteria, so it does not depend upon if you are going to a very prestigious host institution or a host institution which has good reputation. The only evaluation process or the evaluation criteria is excellence, right? So the excellence of the research project, whether it's groundbreaking in nature, it has a huge potential impact. It's how is its scientific approach being laid down? And then there is the excellence of PIs, your intellectual capacity, creativity, and commitment. Of course, these are things that our speakers will be able to detail more to all of you, but let's look at some of the rumors about ERC. The first rumor that currently there are is you can only apply for an ERC grant if you are a highly accomplished scientist, which is not true. Accomplishments are appreciated, of course, in relation to your seniority as giving evidence, but you need to understand that to conduct your research, your purpose or your creativity within the past 10 to 12 years of career, you can always apply for these grants. The second rumor is to be successful, you need to continue on an established research line, which is also not true. Generally, the opposite is true. Rumor number 3, if you have already obtained an ERC grant, you are less or more likely to get another one. Of course, it is not true again, because the panels look at each proposal on its own merit and in comparison with other applications, irrespective of whether you have or have not obtained an ERC grant in the past. Of course, this does not apply for application to a proof of concept, which is not something that is applicable to you. Although today's speakers have received starting and consolidator grant, but it is not a representative sample that we have. Then we have rumor 4, which is the more socially or medically relevant a grant proposal is, the higher chances you have of getting the fund, which is also not true, because ERC funds frontier research and not research that promises to be only incremental or irrespective of field and whether it's societal, medical, or clinical applications. Lastly, the particular focus is on frontier of science and scholarships and engineering. Of course, the idea is where there are multi or interdisciplinary proposals which cross boundaries. between different fields of research, it's something that is regarded highly. Then you have a pioneering proposal that addresses new or emerging fields of research. It is also very good to have such characteristics. And lastly, any proposal that introduces unconventional or innovative approach and scientific invention is always desired highly. Now, this is the second last slide where I just put, of course, you'll receive these slides after our session, but there are certain videos that are included in the ERC classes. So what do you consider to be useful, how to fill in the part B1 and B2, some interviews, how the evaluation works. There are these included on the YouTube channel, which I have provided a link to, but this is something that is there. If there are questions, we are always there to address, right? So if you have questions, don't hesitate to send me a question. I have included my email address also, and also the Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn links so that you can look at what all opportunities come out in the due course of time. And this could be ERC or any European Commission related funding. With that, I think we'll move on to the more interesting part of today's webinar, and I will pass on the floor to Damien, who will be able to give you a much more first-hand advice on how to apply for these ERC grants. Over to you, Damien.
Thank you, Nishant. So I should state at the outset that my approach to this, my background is an archaeologist. So I'm in the social sciences and humanities panel, in particular SH6, which is devoted to understanding the past. And so my experiences and tips and advice may be a little bit more relevant to that domain. So I should note also that my entry into the ERC system came after several years of being, frankly, rather unsuccessful in applications to the Australian Research Council. I spent 7 years or so on rolling postdocs and soft money in the Australian system. I did manage to get 1, 2, or 3 year postgraduate award from the ARC. But one of the problems with my particular research in the Australian system is that my research is very expensive. And because research funds and salaries are more or less decoupled in the Australian system, it was very hard for me to get a grant that I could get grants to do research, but then I didn't have a salary, or I could get a DECRA, a postgraduate award, but then I didn't really have enough money to do the research that I wanted. So the grants weren't really suitable for my research. Whereas in the European context, obviously you can bundle very large amounts of money in for both salaries and research work in a single grant. And I was immediately successful in my first application for an ERC grant. And I found that the work that I had done, the sort of hard slog of many years of not very successful Australian Research Council applications was extremely good training for successful ERC applications in the end. So that's kind of the background that I approach this from. So to look at things roughly in chronological order, I think one of the first things to do when considering putting in an ERC grant application is to think strategically about where you want to go with your career. Obviously, the choice of host institution is really important for you, if not necessarily for the evaluation of the grant. And the usual considerations come into play. Do you want to go for a very prestigious institution, at which you may just be another cog in the machine, or do you want to go perhaps for a niche institution where you may be much more highly valued and looked after essentially as an ERC research grantee? There's lots of institutions that don't have ERC grantees at all, so it's something that's worth considering. Another thing that's important to note is that, very different from Australia, in many countries in Europe, most of the primary scientific research is carried out not so much in universities, but in national science agencies. So this is true of, for instance, in places like France, where the CNRS, the French National Research Agency, carries out the vast majority of primary research and gets the vast majority of ERC grants. So that's something to consider as well when shopping around for a host institution. Another thing to bear in mind is that ERC grants are mobile. So the grants are to you as the researcher, not to the institution. and you should take advantage of that. Institutions can lose you. They're aware that they can lose you, and you should use that leverage to make sure that you're looked after, that the deal that you get is favorable to you, and that you have the research environment that you need to successfully complete your grant. And you can, grants are portable even after you have been awarded the grant, and perhaps even some years into the 5-year grant. You can move really at any time that an institution will accept you. One of the key things to consider there, I guess, is your career path as well. So you may think of it as a 5-year interlude, I guess, in Europe, or you may be, particularly in this kind of job environment, looking for a more secure tenure track position. A thing to remember there is that you can negotiate with your host institution or a prospective host institution to get a permanent position based on the award of your ERC grant. Not all universities will do that. Some universities are prestigious enough that grantees will gravitate towards them anyway, and they know that they really don't have to do much. Whereas other universities recruit full-time permanent faculty on the basis of ERC grants. So you can take your ERC grants to one of these institutions and get a permanent position right off the bat. So that's definitely something to consider, and not something that I was particularly aware of when I started out my career in Europe. Another thing to consider is which country you choose. So there are language issues. I think in France is not one of the countries where you can maybe get by just on English for the entire length of your ERC. I think you can come to France without knowing really much French, but you will really have to sort of pick it up after a couple of years. The same may not be true of places like Germany or the Netherlands, for instance, where you can get by largely in English. Another thing to consider is where your life is at, where your family circumstances are at. Again, if you're looking for a brief interlude in Europe, you may want to consider somewhere like Switzerland or the Netherlands or Italy, which have generous tax allowances for temporary expat workers. On the other hand, if you're starting a family, and for instance, and want to move to Europe permanently, you may consider finding a host institution in a country that has very generous provisions for things like maternity, paternity leave, and this kind of thing. So there's an important balance to be found there, I think. In terms of formulating, let's say, that the big idea, what you plan to do, one of the first things I think to do is to identify really the grand challenges in your field. So the ERC frames these as kind of blue sky grants. They're high risk, high reward projects, which really have to provide breakthroughs in your particular discipline. In my case, as an archaeologist, we're lucky because periodically some luminaries in the field get together and publish articles sort of identifying the grand challenges in the field, which are very useful because you can say right at the outset in your grant, here are the grand challenges in our discipline as identified by these sort of luminaries in the field, and here's how my project addresses these. Another thing to remember is that it can't just be an extension of your previous research. It can't be just more of the same. It has to be something that is genuinely innovative and new. And I think one of the things that it's important to remember, and Nishan pointed this out, is that it's important to be cross-disciplinary. So for me, as an archaeologist, I was very keen in my grants to kind of cross boundaries between archaeology, data science, computer science, geoscience. And I think that's something that assisted me a lot in successfully getting my ERC grants. The more collaborative and broad it is, the more multidisciplinary it is, the better, which of course helps in terms of innovation as well, because unfortunately such kind of true cross-disciplinary collaborations are fairly rare in some fields, particularly I guess in the humanities and social sciences. Another thing that's a really good idea is to identify conferences in your research domain in Europe specifically, and get the idea out there, get feedback from in particular European scholars working on related issues, so you can identify partners and opportunities and host institutions. I think that's really important, and even that name awareness will help, I think, when it comes to evaluating your grant. So And just to give you an example of the sort of big ideas which I proposed, this is the one that I proposed for my starting grant. The fact that we could identify what seemed to be traces of ancient cities beneath the forest in Southeast Asia. And my idea was to use LiDAR, airborne laser scanning, to uncover and map them, so that we could sort of rethink our ideas about jungles as being backwaters of innovation and complexity in the ancient world. And so it marries a sort of a technical innovation with an important theoretical angle there as well. Again, the Consolidator Grant can't just be more of the same, and can't be an extension of existing work, although I wanted to continue doing LiDAR work in Southeast Asia. This one was framed more as a project at the crossroads of archaeology and geosciences and computer science, in that now that we are doing so much LiDAR and there's a sort of LiDAR revolution in archaeology, we can't continue to do the mapping and the analysis of the data in the way that we always have by hand. What we need to do is leverage recent advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning in order to take care of the grunt work for us, in order to focus on these much more important questions of innovation and complexity in the ancient world. And so that's just to give you an idea of what I mean by thinking about big ideas. And you can see that those are ideas that marry traditional approaches in the social sciences and the humanities with emerging technological aspects in geoscience, geophysics, computer science, and these kinds of fields. In my experience, these are the kinds of grants that are the most successful in the humanities and social sciences. When it comes time to put together your grant application, ask for your institution's help. Institutions will have a lot of advice to give you in terms of setting salaries, how to go about procuring the equipment that you need, and all these kinds of things. It's very complex. It's much more complex than ARC grants, and you'll definitely need that kind of help. Ethics are a big part of ERC proposals, so you'll want your institution to provide you with their policies on safe working environments, on OH&S, on policies to do with harassment and discrimination and these kinds of things, and make sure that that's put front and center in the ethics part of your grant as well. A lot of people stumble on that ethics part of the ERC grant process. Your institution will often have an archive of successful grants. That's really important. Get your hands on as many successful ERC grants as you possibly can, and emulate the parts that you think are excellent in those grants. Get in touch with existing grantees. If you don't know any, identify them from published lists of ERC grants. In my experience, ERC grantees are extremely helpful. They'd be very happy to share their grants with you, sometimes perhaps with certain things like salaries redacted, but nonetheless, you'll get the gist of their applications from working with them. Many grantees will be very happy to read and edit your grant proposals as well. So it's an extremely useful thing to do. Don't hesitate to get in touch. You have nothing to lose by asking. Another thing that I noticed, having myself helped out many ERC grantees with their grant applications, is to remember that these are high risk reward grants. And so the framing of your grant, the framing of your idea, and even the language in your grant has to be very positive, affirmative, and confident. You see some applications with language like, if this grant is funded, then my team, as part of our first objective, will aim to move towards this kind of objective. And no, don't do that. Be much more direct and affirmative, as in the first year, our project will do this. In the second year, our project will do that. I think that there's some grant schemes where it pays not to be overly ambitious and not to overstate your sort of ambitions of what you want for the project. ERC grants are definitely not those schemes. It's no place to be sort of modest about who you are in terms of your achievements that you have on your CV or what you would like to achieve in the future. So just at my last slide here, when it comes to the interview process, this is something that's obviously very different from the way that ARC grants work. ERC grants, if you make it to that second stage, you travel to Brussels and have an interview with a panel, with the panel in your discipline. Practice with a mock panel before you go. Practice relentlessly. It's very, very useful. Non-specialists are fine because in fact, the people on your panel are not going to be area specialists. I think in both of my panels, there was about 20, maybe a dozen or 20 people on the panels, and maybe 1 or 2 people were archaeologists who had very directly focused archaeology questions. The rest people were asking general questions, and some of them were fairly tricky as well. So it's important to be prepared. Things like, can you identify what the 3 major risks to the successful completion of your project would be, and how you might deal with those. And so it's important to have prepared responses to those kinds of things. Keep to time, they'll cut you off. You get 10 minutes and the mic literally gets switched off. So make sure your presentation is on time in this interview process. And it's also your opportunity to be visual and to engage the panel with compelling sort of design, the visual aspects of your research, if there are any. The panel will have read your research already. They'll have done the hard slog of reading through the 50 pages or whatever of your research. You don't want to repeat that. What you want to do is deliver a sort of compelling and engaging visual presentation of your research. So for instance, my work revolves around using this LiDAR technology to reveal ancient landscapes beneath the forest. And so one of the slides that I used was this image here of Angkor Wat, these days covered by forest, and giving the idea that we can virtually strip away that vegetation to reveal these very highly patterned traces of cities beneath the forest. So that's all I have to say. I don't want you to take up any of the time of my colleagues, so I'll leave it there. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take those after.
Thank you very much, Damien. I think we were in no hurry for you to finish, because it was just so interesting, even for me to listen to your experience and your tips and advice. And of course, there are a few questions that are coming in. Please keep them coming so that we can address them at the end of Gemma's presentation. So without further ado, I think I'll pass the floor to Gemma so that she could give you some more interesting advices.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slides now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you all very much. And I think Damien's done the hard work there of outlining, I guess, a lot of the issues. So I'll sort of build on that and I guess transition a little bit. I'm a chemist, so I've actually applied to PE4 every time. And that, I guess there's a lot of similarities, but, maybe also some differences in the physical sciences, or at least my experience of physical sciences. So my path to Copenhagen, I'm from Western Australia, started out at UWA, studying chemical physics, but did move to Sydney for both honours and my PhD. Before coming to Europe, I actually left Australia after my PhD, and I postdoced in Chicago at Northwestern University. And I was coming to Europe. I came to Europe from Northwestern. I actually met my Danish husband while I was still in Australia. And when I was in the US, I was applying both in Australia and in Denmark. And as David mentioned, I mean, I didn't have the success with the ERC that I had in Europe. In Europe, I received a Danish grant, and then I was looking for the Danish grant was providing me with salary, but not really big startup funds. So I was looking to sort of supplement that. And that was why I applied to the ERC. And that was actually before I moved to Copenhagen, while I was still in Chicago. And then since 2010, I've been in Copenhagen. So my ERC applications, and I thought, this is also the sort of personal take on things. Of course, what you see publicized is the 2 successful applications. So my starting grant was actually, I applied from the US, and I didn't know any better. So I basically applied as a 2-year starter. I think you saw that the eligibility window for the starting grant is from 2 to 7 years. And once you get to Europe, some people will say, oh, don't apply straight away, wait longer. But as you heard earlier, the success rate, is not necessarily what you would think across the eligibility window. And I was fortunate enough that I received an ERC Starting Grant basically as a 2-year starter. My Consolidator Grant, you can see that it was significantly later. And it would have been in the last year I was eligible to apply as a consolidator, but as you see, I have some of the extensions of eligibility. So what I thought I can also share is I had also 2 unsuccessful applications. Actually, when my first starting grant finished, I was still eligible to apply for the starting grant. So that would have been sort of, towards the end of my eligibility window. But that was unsuccessful. And I applied for a consolidator grant also in 2018, and that was also unsuccessful. That one was actually a very interesting experience. I traveled to Brussels 3 weeks after the birth of my 3rd child, and the ERC was absolutely amazing and supportive. There were all kinds of plans in place in case I couldn't travel. I would have had an online interview, and then they were very, very supportive, making that a very easy trip. But that grant wasn't successful. So I have had the option for extended eligibility because I have 3 children, but as I said, I didn't need it for, in theory, but it was certainly, it gave made things feel a whole lot more relaxed to know that was an option. I had also extension of my first project, the running time, because I had maternity leave during that project. So in terms of my tips, from my side, at least in Copenhagen, there'll be all kinds of workshops that are run, giving advice to people, about how to apply for an ERC grant. But my strongest advice is that, it's really only evaluated by researchers, and in my case, in my field. The panel I'm part of is physical and analytical chemical sciences. So I would say I'm a physical chemist, but yes, analytical chemistry is somewhat further away, but I think the spread in the panel that I was in is not necessarily so large as the spread that Damien was talking about in the humanities. And this difference that it is evaluated by researchers means that what's persuasive, what they see as important, it's not sort of the more bureaucratic aspects of a grant. It is very much the research, and this is both in terms of what are the reasonable costs of research, and that is what it takes to do your project and to support your project in the best way. What is really important, and it is this bottom-up research. It is, is it a really exciting, big new idea? So this is, I think, this is who you're writing to when you write your application. The other thing I would say very much is write the proposal you want to write. The ERC application isn't a form with boxes and pieces and there's you have to fill in these things. It really is blank pieces of paper. Write the proposal that you want to write. And to this extent, I would say that it's important that you remember that you might have heard things about other EU grants, and there's various sort of rumors out there. The ERC is a different kind of grant to that extent. Finally, I would encourage this sort of sense that for me, it has been more than just a grant. It has been a way into a permanent position. It has been a way to promotions. It's very highly valued here in Copenhagen, and it has opened doors for me. So I think that is about the sum of my advice. And I would, finally say, I would just encourage you that there is nothing surer than you won't get it if you don't apply. So I thoroughly encourage you to take this option.
With that, I think please join me in thanking our speakers for today, Gemma and Damien. It's an early start for them in Paris and in Copenhagen, but I'm sure our audience got a lot of useful insights from both of you. We're really optimistic that there will be an increased number of applications to both Starting and Consolidator Grant from the region in 2021. And as mentioned earlier, do keep an eye on our social media platforms to get notified of such informative webinars in the future. With that, we come to an end of today's session and signing off for today and wishing you a very good week ahead. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Nishan. Bye, Gemma.